The asset freeze order felt like a sheet of ice in my hands. My father, Richard, stared at the paper, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "This is how you repay us?" he snarled, his voice echoing off the marble countertops of their sterile kitchen. "For the roof over your head? For the food we put in your mouth? That money was our right." My mother, Carol, stood behind him, her hand fluttering at her chest as if she were the victim here. I just stood my ground, my lawyer beside me, and said the words that had been caught in my throat for a decade. "You don't get to decide what's yours anymore." The words hung in the air, clean and sharp, right before the uniformed officer with us cleared his throat, a sound that officially severed the last thread of the family I thought I had. My name is Liam, and this is the story of how the two people who were supposed to build my future tried to steal it instead. It's a story about a lie that was 20 years in the making, and the fight to reclaim not just my savings, but my own name. I'm about to tell you something I've barely told anyone. But before I do, if you could just say hi or tell me what city you're listening from in the comments, it would mean the world. It's a reminder that even when your own family makes you feel completely alone, you're not. Thank you. And if this story resonates with you, please think about subscribing. Your support helps build a space where stories like ours can be heard and where we can remind each other that we deserve to be safe. And now, let me start from the beginning. It all started on a Tuesday, under the perpetually gray sky of a Portland autumn. My world was small, but it was mine. It was the smell of coffee and ozone in my second-floor apartment, the soft hum of my workstation, and the glow of my monitors casting long shadows on the wall. For 5 years, every waking hour that wasn't spent at my soul-crushing agency job was poured into my own freelance animation work. I lived on instant noodles and cheap takeout. My car was a decade-old sedan with a personality disorder, and my social life was practically non-existent. Every single dollar, every sacrifice, was a brick in the foundation of my dream. A savings account with $95,412 in it. That number was more than money. It was sacred. It was the down payment for a small commercial space downtown. It was the seed money for my own studio, which I was going to call North Star Animation. It was the escape velocity I needed to finally break free from a life of working for other people's dreams and start building my own. It was, in every sense of the word, my entire future, quantified and sitting safely behind a password and a two-factor authentication code, or so I thought. The phone rang that afternoon, and my mother's name lit up the screen. A familiar coil of anxiety tightened in my gut. Our calls weren't about catching up, they were check-ins, subtle interrogations disguised as maternal concern. "Liam, honey, how are you?" Carol's voice was like warm honey, thick and sweet and designed to stick. I gave her the usual vague answers. Work was fine, Portland was rainy, I was busy. I kept my life compartmentalized, giving her only the bland, polished surfaces she couldn't get a grip on. "Well, your father is finally retiring," she announced, a theatrical sigh in her voice. "And I wanted to have a special family dinner for him this Saturday, just us, here at the house. We haven't seen you in months, and it would mean the world to him." Every instinct in my body screamed. It's a trap. A special dinner was code. It meant I was walking into an arena. It meant hours of Richard pontificating about his new ventures that always required an investment, and Carol asking probing questions about my salary, my savings, my irresponsible city rent. I could already hear the soft voice of my therapist, Dr. Anya Sharma, in my head. "Liam, you don't have to own their expectations. Just observe. Be a scientist studying a strange phenomenon. You're just taking a temperature reading." "I don't know, Mom. I have a huge deadline," I lied, the excuse already sounding weak. "Oh, don't be silly," she chided gently, the steel under the velvet. "This is for your father. After all he's done for you, you can spare one evening. Please, honey." For me, the guilt was a perfectly crafted weapon, and she wielded it with surgical precision. And a small stupid part of me, the part that still wanted to believe in the family from television commercials, whispered, "What if this time is different? What if they're finally proud of you?" That flicker of hope was all she needed. I agreed. As I hung up, I looked at the concept art for my studio's logo pinned to my wall, a simple, elegant compass rose with a bright North Star at its center. I was so close. One more dinner, one more performance. I just had to get through one more night, and then I was free. The drive from Portland to Lake Oswego is only 20 minutes, but it might as well be a journey to another planet. You leave the city's comfortable, chaotic energy, the murals on brick walls, the cyclists, the weird and wonderful hum of it all, and cross over into a silent, manicured world of sweeping driveways and houses the size of hotel lobbies. My parents' home was one of them. The modest split-level house I grew up in had been torn down and replaced with a modern monstrosity of glass, steel, and stark white stone. It didn't look like a home. It looked like an architect's ego given a blank check. I parked my beat-up sedan behind my father's new black Mercedes, feeling like I was parking a tricycle next to a spaceship. Before I could even ring the bell, the heavy front door swung open. My mother, Carol, stood there, beaming, wrapped in a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Liam, you made it." She enveloped me in a hug that smelled overpoweringly of gardenias and hairspray. It wasn't a warm hug, it was a possessive one, a demonstration. My father appeared behind her, a broad, practiced smile on his face. Richard was tan and silver-haired, looking less like a retiree and more like the CEO of a company that sells yachts. He shook my hand with a grip that was meant to establish dominance, clapping me on the shoulder a little too hard. "Good to see you, son. Glad you could pull yourself away from your projects." The inside of the house was even more sterile than the outside. The floors were gleaming white marble, the furniture was all sharp angles and chrome, and a massive, soulless abstract painting hung over a gas fireplace that flickered with fake, unnervingly blue flames. There wasn't a single photograph, not a single book out of place. It was a showroom, a stage set for a play about wealthy, successful people. "We've made a few upgrades," Richard said, gesturing expansively at the cavernous living room. "The Italian marble alone was a nightmare to get installed, but you get what you pay for, right?" He winked, and I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The story I'd been getting for the last year was one of financial hardship, of a pension that wasn't enough, of rising costs. This was not the home of people who were struggling. Dinner was served on a 10-foot-long glass table. The meal was, of course, a performance. My mother recounted a recent squabble with the neighborhood association, casting herself as the gracious but firm matriarch. My father launched into a long-winded monologue about a new investment opportunity in offshore wind farms. It was vague, full of buzzwords, and had the distinct smell of a scam. And then, as I knew they would, the questions started. "So, Liam," Carol began, dabbing her lips with a cloth napkin, "that animation work is going well? You must be saving up a good amount. Are you still throwing money away on that tiny apartment?" "I like my apartment, Mom. It's close to everything," I said, keeping my voice level. "Nonsense," Richard scoffed. "A man your age should be building equity. You should be buying a condo at least, unless your money isn't working for you." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "I could help you with that. That new venture I was talking about? It's a guaranteed home run. A small initial investment from you could set you up for life. Just observe. Be a scientist," I told myself, feeling my jaw tighten. "I'm happy with my own financial plan, Dad. Thanks." My mother sighed dramatically and rose from the table. "Well, if we can't talk business, let's at least celebrate properly." She returned with a bottle of red wine, the label old and dusty. "I saved this for a special occasion," she cooed, making a grand show of uncorking it. "None for me, I have my water, and your father has his scotch. This is all for you, honey. A toast to our brilliant, successful son." She poured a generous glass and placed it in front of me, her hand lingering near the rim. The gesture felt strangely intimate and deeply unsettling. I don't usually drink when I have to drive, but refusing would have ignited a war. I took a sip to appease her. The wine was heavy and had a bitter, metallic aftertaste that clung to the back of my tongue. I forced a smile. "It's robust." She smiled, a triumphant little glint in her eye. "I knew you'd like it." Throughout the rest of dinner, she was constantly refilling my glass. I'd take a small sip, and as soon as I set it down, her hand would be there with the bottle, topping it off. The conversation swirled around me, their voices starting to sound distant, buffered by a strange layer of cotton. My head felt heavy, my limbs like lead. The edges of the room began to soften and blur. I remember my father laughing at some joke he told, a loud booming sound that didn't seem to quite connect with my ears. I knew I needed to leave, to get up and get out, but my body wouldn't obey. The last clear thought I had was that the blue flames in the fireplace looked like they were dancing underwater. Then, even that slipped away. I woke up to a silence so absolute it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. The guest room was bleached by the pale, unforgiving light of a gray morning. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. This wasn't my room, with its organized chaos of sketchbooks and charging cables. This was a sterile white box. The sheets were stiff and cold, the air smelled of nothing, and the generic abstract art on the wall, a swirl of beige and gray, seemed to mock me. My head throbbed with a dull chemical ache, a sledgehammer pounding in time with my pulse. My mouth tasted like rust and stale, bitter wine. I pushed myself up, my body feeling unnaturally heavy, as if gravity had doubled during the night. I felt a deep, primal sense of wrongness, the kind your body understands before your brain does. This wasn't a hangover, this was an erasure. I had no memory of coming to this room, no memory of saying goodnight. The last thing I remembered was the blue fire, dancing. Then, a sound cut through the oppressive quiet. A single, sharp buzz from the nightstand. My phone. I reached for it, my movements clumsy and uncoordinated. My hand was shaking. I squinted at the screen, the light searing my eyes, and blinked until the notification swam into focus. It was from my bank. Transaction alert. A transfer of $95,000 from your North Star savings has been completed. The sentence didn't compute. My brain simply refused to process it. It was like reading a sentence in a language I didn't speak, a mistake. It had to be a system glitch, a weird server error. I blinked again, expecting the numbers to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. My thumb, slick with a sudden cold sweat, slid across the screen to unlock it. Another notification was waiting just below the first one. Transaction alert. A transfer of $412 from your primary checking has been completed. Your new balance, $78.14. The air left my lungs in a single, silent rush. It felt like a punch to the chest, a physical impact that knocked the breath out of me and left me gasping. The room tilted. The white walls seemed to press in, the silence now a roaring in my ears. I could feel the blood drain from my face, a cold tide pulling away from my skin, leaving it numb and tight. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird trying to beat its way out. This couldn't be real. It was a nightmare. I was still asleep, still drowning in that drugged wine, and I would wake up soon in my own bed. With a violently trembling hand, I opened the banking app. My fingerprint, the key to my entire future, felt alien against the scanner. The app loaded, and the screen that appeared was a monument to my ruin. Savings, $0. Checking, $78.14. It was all gone. Every dollar, every sacrifice. Every late night and lonely weekend. 5 years of my life, vaporized. I scrolled down, my vision blurring with hot, sudden tears. The transaction history was a brutal, merciless ledger. Transfer, transfer, transfer. All made between 2 and 3 a.m., all authorized from my device. All sent to a single, unfamiliar account number. A fingerprint icon was next to each one. My fingerprint. I dropped the phone on the bed as if it had burned me. The physical violation hit me then, a wave of nausea so powerful I had to brace myself against the nightstand. They didn't just hack me, they didn't just guess a password. While I was unconscious, helpless in their house, one of them had come in here. One of them had taken my hand, pressed my thumb to the screen of my own phone, and systematically dismantled my life. The image flashed in my mind, my mother's gentle hand, my father's confident grip, and I felt a gag rise in my throat. I sat on the edge of the bed, in that silent, sterile room, the morning light falling on my face, and I felt nothing. It was a void. A vast, silent, screaming emptiness where $95,000 and the concept of family used to be. Everything was gone. The roaring in my head was deafening, yet the house remained utterly silent. It was the kind of quiet that feels like a judgment, a stillness that had absorbed everything, leaving me alone with the wreckage. I pressed my palms flat against the cool surface of the nightstand, trying to ground myself, to stop the trembling that had taken root deep in my bones. They did it again. The thought wasn't a surprise. It was a cold, hard echo of every previous betrayal. It was the bitter truth I'd been trying to outrun my entire adult life. Memory didn't come back in a smooth, cinematic reel, but in sharp, jarring flashes, like static electricity sparking in a dark room. Each one was a tiny, excruciating wound. Flash 1, age 7. I'm standing in the hallway, pajamas twisted, clutching my prized rocket, ship piggy bank. It was ceramic, painted bright blue with silver fins, and I'd been saving for a new remote control car. Richard, my father, in a fit of manufactured panic about an unexpected bill, took it from me. I remember the sharp, sickening crack as he smashed it on the kitchen floor, coins scattering like shrapnel. "Don't worry, son," he'd said, his voice oozing false comfort. "Daddy will pay you back double. Just a temporary loan." He never did. The remote control car remained a distant dream. Flash 2, age 12. The smell of dust and desperation in a pawn shop. I'd saved meticulously for a top-of-the-line skateboard, a shiny red deck with custom trucks. It was my ticket to freedom, to the skate park where all the cool older kids hung out. One morning, it was just gone from my closet. Richard later claimed he'd sold it for emergency car repairs. He promised to buy me a better one. He never did. I walked past the skate park for weeks, the hollow ache in my stomach, a constant reminder. Flash 3, age 16. The floorboard beneath my bed creaks as I slide a shoebox into the secret compartment I'd carved out myself. Inside, a wad of wrinkled bills, my earnings from mowing lawns, babysitting, washing cars carefully stacked. I'd seen the signs. The casual loans from my wallet, the disappearing loose change. This money was for my first used car, my escape. A week later, the lid of the shoebox was crooked. The wad of cash was thinner. My mother, Carol, found me in tears, clutching the depleted box. "Your father just needs one lucky break, honey," she'd cooed, stroking my hair. "One big win, and everything will be fine." One big win always meant one more loss for me. These were the echoes in the static, the recurring nightmare that had shaped my adolescence, forcing me to build a fortress around my meager possessions, around my very sense of self. Each time, their justifications had been perfectly crafted, their smiles just crooked enough to be charming, their promises like smoke. I had fled Colorado Springs at 18 with a beat-up duffel bag, $400, and a car that stalled on every hill. I'd built a life in Portland out of sheer stubborn will, stacking shifts, taking every freelance gig, learning to live on 4 hours of sleep and show up like I'd had 8. Community college had been my oxygen, my GPA, a shield against the chaos of my past. Olivia, my creative director at the agency, had seen something in my early animation concepts, a spark, and given me my first real shot. I had meticulously saved, not just money, but a part of myself. The $95,000 wasn't just a number. It was every early morning, every late night, every client pitch, every ramen dinner. It was a testament that I could control something, that I could build something real. It was the studio with white walls and bright windows where no one could gaslight my memory or rewrite my history. And now, in this stark guest room, the numbers on my phone screamed one brutal fact. I hadn't just lost money. I had lost the years I had used to scrub the past off me. They hadn't just stolen funds. They had stolen my peace, my escape, my new beginning. The roar in my head intensified. They did it again. They always do. And this time I knew was the last time. The tremor in my hands subsided, replaced by an unnerving, ice-cold calm. The initial shock had burned itself out, leaving behind something harder, something forged in the fires of 2 decades of quiet betrayals. This was the last time, the final echo. I stood up, moving with a deliberate, almost robotic precision. I folded the clothes I'd worn the night before and placed them in my backpack. I zipped every pocket, checked for my wallet, my keys. Every small, methodical action was an act of defiance, a way of reclaiming control in a room where all my control had been stolen. I moved through the silent house like a ghost, my footsteps swallowed by the plush, expensive rugs. The air was thick with the smell of stale wine and deceit. I felt a desperate, primal urge to smash something, to shatter the cold marble and glass facade of their lives, but I suppressed it. Noise was their weapon. Silence would be mine. Before I walked out the door, I made a choice. I needed to hear it from them. I needed the final, undeniable proof to extinguish that last, stupid flicker of hope. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over my mother's contact. I pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring, her voice a little too bright, a little too rehearsed. "Liam, good morning, honey. I was just about to make some coffee. Did you sleep well?" The casualness of it was breathtaking. I kept my voice flat, devoid of any emotion. I'm leaving now, Mom. There was a slight pause. Oh, so soon? But you just woke up. You must feel awful after all that wine. It was probably a bit too strong for you, I should have realized. She was already building the narrative, laying the foundation for the gaslighting. I checked my bank account, I said, cutting through her performance. The silence on the other end of the line was electric. It stretched for 3, 4, 5 seconds. I could hear her breath catch, the soft, panicked intake of air. Honey, you sound very confused, she finally said, her voice strained. We really should talk about this after you've had a chance to clear your head. Your father and I didn't let her finish. I hung up. I didn't need to hear the rest of the lie. The hesitation, the panic in her voice, that was the confession. I walked out the front door, not bothering to close it softly behind me. The cool, damp Oregon air felt like a baptism, washing the suffocating atmosphere of that house off my skin. I was halfway to my car when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Carol. My heart pounded as I read the words, the ultimate act of maternal betrayal dressed up as concern. Liam, honey, hope you're okay. We were so worried when we saw you leave. Listen, about the money. Richard heard a terrifying report about a coming market crash, and we got scared. We had to move your savings somewhere safe to protect it for you. It was an emergency. We'll explain everything later. Please don't worry. We love you. I stood there in the middle of their perfect, manicured driveway, staring at the message, the bait. It was so clumsy, so insulting in its transparency. They thought I was still that 7-year-old kid who would believe a story about a temporary loan. The anger that rose in me was white-hot, a blinding inferno. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, ready to unleash a torrent of rage, to call them the monsters they were. And then, the switch flipped. A voice, calm and clear in the middle of the inferno, whispered, "You can't win a game that's rigged. Your only move is not to play." Arguing with them would be like wrestling with ghosts in a hall of mirrors. They would twist my words, my anger, my pain, and use it all as proof of my instability. I would be the ungrateful, confused, emotional son, and they would be the concerned, heroic parents. I took a deep breath. My thumb moved from the keyboard to the message itself. I held it down, and a small menu popped up. Without hesitating, I pressed delete. The message vanished. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. It was the sound of a chain breaking. It was the first time in my life I had refused to take their bait. I got in my car, started the engine, and pulled out of their driveway without looking back. I drove for 5 minutes, then pulled over to the side of the road. I opened my contacts again. My finger scrolled past Dad, past Mum. It landed on a name I hadn't called in years. My estranged aunt, my mother's sister, Yenna. I pressed the button, a new resolve hardening in my chest. I was done playing their game. It was time to start my own. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Her voice was older than I remembered, a little raspy, but it was unmistakably Jenna's. "Liam, my God, is everything all right?" The dam broke. The cold resolve I had maintained in that house shattered, and for a full minute, all I could do was choke out the story in ragged, broken pieces. The dinner, the wine, the empty accounts. I expected shock, disbelief, a flood of questions. Instead, what I got was a deep, world-weary sigh that spoke volumes. "Oh, Liam, I am so, so sorry," she said, her voice filled with a profound sadness. "So, they finally did it to you too." That one sentence, "to you too," was a lifeline. It wasn't just in my head. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice raw. Jenna hesitated. "Your mother and I, we don't speak for a reason. Years ago, after our own mother passed, she left us both a small inheritance. Nothing huge, but enough to make a difference. Carol was the executor of the will. She convinced me to let her invest my half along with hers, said Richard had a foolproof plan. Sound familiar?" The rhetorical question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. A month later, my inheritance was gone, vanished. When I confronted her, she gave me the same performance I'm sure you're about to get. It was the market's fault. I was being ungrateful and dramatic. I was tearing the family apart over a little bit of money. It wasn't about the money, Liam. It was about the lie. She chose him and his schemes over her own sister. I never saw a dime of it, and I haven't spoken to her since. Hearing her story felt like a key turning in a lock I never knew existed. My whole life, I'd been told the narrative that Aunt Jenna was difficult and unstable. Now I knew the truth. She wasn't difficult, she was free. What do I do, Jenna? I asked, the question feeling impossibly heavy. You don't play their game, she said, her voice hardening with a protective fire. You get a lawyer, not just any lawyer. I have a name for you. He's not a bulldog, he's a surgeon. He helped me untangle the legal mess Carol tried to leave me in. His name is Marcus Thorne. And Liam, you document everything. The drive back to Portland was different. I wasn't retreating, I was regrouping. The familiar skyline of my city didn't look like a place to hide, it looked like my fortress. I walked into my apartment, and the comfortable clutter of my creative life now looked like the headquarters for a rebellion. I sat down at my workstation, the dual monitors humming to life, and for the next 5 hours, I channeled every ounce of my shock, grief, and white-hot anger into a single, focused task. I began to forge my sword. I created a new, encrypted folder on my hard drive and named it simply The Case. Then, I began to fill it. First, I took high-resolution screenshots of every single fraudulent transaction. I annotated each one with the exact time and amount. The numbers looked like casualties in a war report. Next, I dove into my online banking portal's security settings. I was good with tech, and I knew where to look. I found the full access log and downloaded it. There it was, in black and white, a series of logins from a single IP address between 2:07 a.m. and 3:14 a.m. I ran a quick search. The IP address was registered to a residential account in Lake Oswego, right on my parents' street. It was the digital equivalent of a bloody fingerprint at a crime scene. Then, I accessed my phone's own security logs. I found the record of the biometric scanner being activated for the banking app at 2:09 a.m., 2:25 a.m., 2:40 a.m., and 3:12 a.m. Concrete proof that my physical body had been used to authorize the theft while I was unconscious. Finally, I opened a blank document. I wrote down everything I could remember from the night before, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The strange, bitter taste of the wine, the way my mother insisted on refilling my glass, the memory gaps, the specific wording of her manipulative text message, which I had deleted from my phone but seared into my brain. I transcribed it word for word. I wrote down the lies I'd been told as a child, the piggy bank, the skateboard, the college fund. I was building a fortress of facts, a wall of evidence so high and so solid that their lies would never be able to climb it. When I was done, the sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across my apartment. I looked at the neatly organized files on my screen. This wasn't just data, it was my truth, codified and undeniable. I picked up my phone and dialed the number Jenna had given me. A calm, professional voice answered. Law offices of Marcus Thorne. I took a deep breath, my voice steady and clear. My name is Liam Parker. I was referred by a former client, Jenna. I need to report a theft of $95,000. The perpetrators were my parents. I have the bank records, the IP logs, and the biometric timestamps to prove it. 3 days later, I drove back to Lake Oswego. The sky was the color of bruised plums, a heavy, oppressive ceiling of clouds that threatened a downpour. This time, I wasn't alone. I was following the sleek, dark gray sedan of Marcus Thorne, a man whose quiet confidence was more intimidating than any overt aggression could ever be. A few car lengths behind us, a discreet county sheriff's vehicle followed, carrying the civil standby officer Marcus had requested. This wasn't a family visit, this was a legal proceeding. My heart was a cold, heavy stone in my chest, but for the first time in my life I wasn't afraid of them. I had the truth on my side, and the truth had brought reinforcements. We pulled into the sweeping driveway. Marcus was out of his car before I had turned off my engine, his leather briefcase in hand. I met him at the foot of the oversized front door, and the officer, a tall, stoic man whose expression gave nothing away, took up a position a few feet behind us. Marcus looked at me, his eyes calm. Let me do the talking. Your only job is to be present. Don't engage, don't argue. Just stand your ground. You are the plaintiff now. Let the process work. I gave a single, sharp nod. Marcus rang the doorbell. The melodic, artificial chimes echoed from within the marble tomb. A few moments later, the door swung open. It was Carol. She was dressed in an expensive-looking silk blouse, a practiced socialite smile already on her face. The smile froze. then melted into a mask of confusion as she saw not just me, but the two men flanking me. "Liam," she said, her voice laced with manufactured concern. "What is all this? Who are these men? Is everything all right?" She reached for my arm, a classic maneuver to pull me into her narrative, to cast herself as the worried mother. I took a half step back, just out of her reach. The small movement was a declaration. I was no longer playing my part. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic in their depths. "Mrs. Parker," Marcus said, his voice polite but firm as steel. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am Liam Parker's legal counsel. May we come in?" He didn't wait for an answer, stepping just over the threshold, forcing her to back away. The officer and I followed, stopping in the grand, sterile foyer. The air grew thick and cold. Richard emerged from the living room, a newspaper in his hand. "What's all the commotion?" He boomed, then stopped dead when he saw our formation. His eyes narrowed, darting from me to Marcus, to the uniformed officer. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice dropping into the authoritarian tone he used to command salesmen and belittle his son. Carol rushed to his side, clutching his arm. "Richard, I don't understand. Liam brought these men to our home. He won't even speak to me." She began to sniffle, her shoulders trembling with the beginnings of a well-rehearsed sob. "How could you do this to your own mother, frightening me like this?" I stared at a point on the wall just past her head, focusing on the soulless beige abstract painting. "Be a scientist. Just observe." The words were my mantra. Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a sheaf of documents. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," he said calmly, "we are here to serve you with this." He held out the papers. "It is a temporary restraining order, freezing your financial assets pending a full investigation into the fraudulent transfer of $95,412 from Mr. Parker's accounts on the night of the 6th of September. Richard stared at the papers as if they were a venomous snake. He didn't take them. He just laughed, a short, ugly, barking sound. "You've got to be kidding me. You think you can come into my house and threaten me? This is a family matter." He pointed a trembling finger at me. "And you're pathetic. Running to a lawyer because of a simple family loan? I've given you everything." "This was not a loan, Mr. Parker," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "It was theft, and we have the digital forensics to prove it was executed from this house while my client was unconscious." The word unconscious landed in the room like a grenade. Carol let out a small, theatrical gasp, but Richard's face contorted, the charming mask finally cracking to reveal the raw, narcissistic rage beneath. He lunged forward, snatching the papers from Marcus's hand. His eyes, burning with fury, locked onto mine. "This is how you repay us?" he snarled, the words echoing off the marble floors, each one a hammer blow of self-righteous fury. "For the roof over your head? For the food we put in your mouth? For every single thing you have? We built you. That money was our right." There it was. Not an apology, not a denial, a confession, a declaration of his entitled, parasitic worldview, laid bare in the cold light of day. It was the ugliest and most validating thing I had ever heard. His voice was rising to a shout, and he took a step toward me. Before he could take a second, the officer moved. He didn't touch Richard, but his presence was a solid wall. "Sir," the officer said, his voice low and steady, a profound and unshakable calm, "I suggest you take a step back and keep your voice down." The command, coming from an agent of the law inside his own home, seemed to stun Richard into silence. The authority he wielded within these walls had just collided with a greater authority, and it buckled. He stood there, speechless, clutching the papers that signified the end of his reign. The door between his private, lawless kingdom and the real world had just been kicked wide open. Marcus gave me a slight nod. Our work here was done. We turned and walked out, leaving them in the silent, cavernous foyer. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of their world, the one built on lies and illusions, beginning to collapse behind me. The drive back to Portland was a blur of gray highway, and the rhythmic thump-thump of my windshield wipers battling a persistent drizzle. The adrenaline from the confrontation had evaporated, leaving behind a deep, cavernous exhaustion. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. I had done it. I had faced them, not as a son, but as an adversary, and I hadn't flinched. The feeling wasn't triumph. It was the grim, hollow satisfaction of a surgeon who has just completed a necessary amputation. The limb was gone, the sickness cut out, but the phantom pain was just beginning. My phone buzzed with a call from a number I now had saved. It was Marcus. "Liam," he said, his voice calm and steady as ever. "You did well today. That was the hardest part. Now they know we are not bluffing. They'll retain counsel, and we'll start receiving communications from their lawyers soon. For now, I want you to do one thing for me. Do not, under any circumstances, communicate with them. No calls, no texts, no emails. Let them make the next move. You just focus on your work and let me handle the rest." I promised I would, thanking him before hanging up. For a moment, a sliver of peace settled over me. I had a process. I had an advocate. I wasn't alone. That peace lasted for approximately 2 hours. I was back in my apartment, trying to lose myself in the familiar comfort of an animation timeline, when my phone, which I'd set to silent, began to vibrate on the desk. It didn't stop. It buzzed continuously, a frantic, insistent rhythm against the wood. I picked it up, confused. The screen was a cascade of notifications, all from one app I rarely opened: Facebook. Dozens of them. Deborah Smith commented on Carol Parker's post. Uncle Henry tagged you in a comment. Brenda Miles sent you a message. My blood ran cold. With a sense of profound dread, I tapped the notification. It took me to my mother's page. The post was less than an hour old. The picture was a professionally taken photo of her and my father from a few years back, both of them dressed up, smiling warmly at the camera. They looked like the perfect, loving couple. They looked like victims. And then there was the caption: "It is with the heaviest heart that I write this. Richard and I have devoted our entire lives to our family and above all to our son. To be repaid in our golden years with such unimaginable cruelty is a pain no parent should ever have to endure. Today, our son brought lawyers and police officers into our home and is trying to take everything we have worked for. We are shattered and confused and don't know what we could have possibly done to deserve this attack. For our friends and family who truly know our hearts, please pray for us. Pray that our son finds his way back from this anger and that our family can somehow heal." The hypocrisy was so blatant, so perfectly crafted, it was almost a work of art. She had omitted every single fact: the drugging, the theft, the years of financial abuse, and painted a masterpiece of maternal martyrdom. The post was a weapon, and it had been aimed directly at me. The comment section was a bloodbath. It was the digital pillory, and I had been locked in the center of town for everyone to see. "Uncle Henry, Carol, this is just disgraceful. Richard has been nothing but generous to that boy his whole life. Some kids today have zero loyalty, none. Aunt Beatrice, Carol's other sister. My heart just breaks for you and Richard. Some children are just born with a poison inside them. You gave him everything, and he throws it back in your face. Stay strong, my dear sister. The truth will prevail. Brenda Miles, a former neighbor. I am just shocked to my core. Liam, I remember you being such a sweet, quiet boy. What happened? Your parents love you more than anything in this world. Whatever this is, you need to call your mother and fix it. Family is everything." On and on it went. 100 digital pitchforks, wielded by people I had known my entire life. Distant cousins, old high school friends, former co-workers of my dad's. They were all there, lining up to like and sad react and offer their tearful, emoji-laden support for the two biggest liars I had ever known. My name was being dragged through a public square of gossip and speculation, my character assassinated in real time. I felt a suffocating sense of powerlessness. My fingers twitched over the comment box. I wanted to scream the truth. "She drugged me. He stole my life savings. This is all a lie." But I could hear Marcus's voice in my head. "Do not communicate with them. Engaging would be a fatal mistake. They would screenshot my rage, call it proof of my instability, and use it against me." The court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict based on a single, perfectly executed lie. I threw my phone onto the couch as if it were on fire. I paced my small apartment, my chest tight, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The walls felt like they were closing in. They hadn't just stolen my money. They were now systematically stealing my name, my history, my relationships. They were salting the earth of my entire past, ensuring that even if I won in court, I would be an outcast from the world I grew up in. I sat down in the dark, the only light in the room, the relentless, accusatory glow of my phone screen, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt utterly and completely alone. For the next 48 hours, I lived in a self-imposed exile. My phone was turned face down on the kitchen counter, its silent, dark screen a thin barrier against the tidal wave of judgment I knew was still raging on the other side. The curtains in my apartment were drawn. The world outside, with its normal rhythms of traffic and life, felt distant and unreal. I was adrift in a sea of digital condemnation, and the isolation was crushing. The worst part was the insidious whisper of self-doubt. Maybe they're right. Maybe you are ungrateful. Maybe you did break the family. Maybe you should have just let it go. The voice sounded a lot like my mother's. I was at my lowest point, questioning everything, when a single, insistent text message cut through the static. It was from my cousin Ethan, just 3 words. Dude, check FB now. My first instinct was to ignore it. I couldn't bear to look at that post again, to see the fresh wave of comments from people who had once patted me on the head and told me I was a good kid. But Ethan's tone was urgent. With a deep, steadying breath, I picked up the phone, my thumb shaking as I opened the app. I navigated to Carol's page, my eyes scanning the familiar, hateful territory. And there, nestled among the syrupy condolences and passive-aggressive rebukes, was a long, fiery comment. It was from Ethan. This is the most manipulative, self-serving garbage I have ever read, and everyone here blindly offering prayers should be ashamed of themselves. I have had a front row seat to Uncle Richard and Aunt Carol's financial and emotional abuse of Liam for 20 years. I was there when they borrowed his high school graduation money and never paid it back. I was there when they guilt-tripped him into turning down a scholarship so he could stay closer to home. This isn't a misunderstanding, it's the final act of a lifelong con. Liam is the hardest-working, most loyal person I know, and he is finally standing up for himself. Instead of asking what Liam did, maybe you should be asking why my aunt and uncle, who were supposedly struggling so much, suddenly have brand new Italian marble floors and a Mercedes in the driveway. Wake up. I read it once, then twice. The words of balm on a raw, open wound. It was a tactical nuke dropped into the middle of my mother's pity party. He used specifics. He used details. And he finished with the marble floors, a perfect, damning piece of evidence that planted a seed of doubt in the fertile ground of their lies. A few replies had already popped up below his comment, mostly from Aunt Beatrice, sputtering about family loyalty, but the damage was done. The unified front had been broken. Someone from the inside had called them out. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. As I was still staring at Ethan's words, a new notification appeared, a message request. It was from a name I hadn't seen in years, David Henderson. He was our old neighbor, a quiet, retired widower who had lived next door to my parents for most of my life. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. Liam, it's Dave Henderson. I hope this message finds you well, all things considered. I saw your mother's post on Facebook. I'm not one for public drama, but I felt compelled to reach out to you privately. I want you to know that I believe you. About 5 years ago, your father approached me about a can't-miss investment in a small real estate development. It was a few $1,000s, money I couldn't really afford to lose. The deal fell through, and the money was just gone. He had a dozen plausible excuses, of course. It was never his fault. It wasn't enough for me to sue over, but it was enough for me to learn what kind of man he islanded. I just wanted you to know that you are not crazy, and you are not alone in this. Stay strong, son. I sat there, the phone in my hands, tears welling in my eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of profound, overwhelming relief. It was corroboration. It was validation from an objective, third-party source. The wall of shame my mother had so carefully constructed around me had just developed 2 massive cracks. My fingers flew as I typed a reply to Ethan, a raw, heartfelt thank you that barely scratched the surface of my gratitude. Then, I took a screenshot of Mr. Henderson's message. I opened my email, attached the image, and sent it to Marcus Thorne. The subject line was simple, potential witness to a pattern of behavior. I looked at my phone again. The digital pillory was still there, the negative comments hadn't vanished. But they no longer held the same power. They were just noise now. I had allies. I had evidence. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, I knew with absolute certainty that I was no longer fighting it alone. The weeks that followed were a slow, grinding crawl through the machinery of the legal system. My parents, forced to act, hired a lawyer, a slick, overconfident man named Davies, whose specialty seemed to be turning family disputes into muddy wars of attrition. Emails were exchanged, motions were filed. The battle moved from the public square of Facebook to the quiet, paper-strewn trenches of the law, and then came the date for the depositions. We met in a sterile conference room in a downtown high-rise, a neutral territory of polished mahogany and soundproof walls. The air was thick with a tense, artificial quiet. I sat on one side of the long table with Marcus, my files stacked neatly in front of me. On the other side sat my father, Richard, his jaw set like concrete, and my mother, Carol, looking pale and fragile, clutching his arm in a display of wifely solidarity. Their lawyer, Davies, shuffled papers with an air of bored theatricality. Marcus began the questioning of my father, his voice calm and dispassionate. He moved with the precision of a surgeon, laying the foundation of his case piece by methodical piece. He started with the renovations. Mr. 1. Parker, could you confirm that you began extensive renovations on your home in July, including the installation of imported Italian marble? We made some home improvements, yes, Richard grunted, shooting a look at his lawyer. And could you tell the court where the funds for these improvements, totaling over $60,000, came from? Our savings, Richard said, his voice clipped. Davies nodded approvingly. Marcus placed a folder on the table. Interesting, because your bank statements, which we subpoenaed, show your savings account was nearly depleted at the time. However, a new account was opened on the 7th of September, and the first payments to the contractors were made from it the very next day. This was the same day $95,000 was transferred from your son's account. Can you explain that coincidence? Richard's face began to flush. It was a loan, a family arrangement. Marcus didn't blink. He slid another document across the table, a printout of the IP logs. Can you explain why this family arrangement was executed via your home's IP address at 2:07 inches the morning while your son was unconscious in your guest room? Davies interjected. Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence about my client's son's state of consciousness. I'll rephrase, Marcus said smoothly. Can you explain why you accessed your son's bank account in the middle of the night? We were protecting his assets, Richard blustered, his voice rising. We were acting in his best interest. The pressure mounted with every question. Marcus brought up Mr. Henderson's testimony, establishing a pattern of deceit. He brought up Ethan's statement. With each piece of evidence, another brick was laid in the wall closing in around my father. Richard grew more agitated, his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. The final blow came from a place he never expected. Mr. Parker, Marcus said, his tone softening slightly. Let's talk about your son's childhood. Do you recall him owning a blue, rocket-shaped piggy bank when he was 7? Richard stared, dumbfounded. What the hell does that have to do with anything? Davies leaned in, whispering. Just answer the question, Richard. I don't remember, he snarled. You don't remember smashing it on the kitchen floor to pay a bill you claimed was an emergency? Marcus pressed. You don't remember pawning his skateboard? Or taking cash from a shoebox hidden under his bed? That was it. The attack on his character, his carefully curated image as a provider and a father, was more than his ego could withstand. He was no longer a defendant in a fraud case. He was a patriarch whose authority was being questioned. That's enough, Davies said, rising slightly. We're taking a 5-minute recess. But it was too late. The dam of Richard's narcissistic rage had burst. He shot to his feet, slamming both palms down on the mahogany table. The sound cracked through the silent room like a gunshot. Yes, he roared, his face a mask of purple fury. His eyes weren't on Marcus, they were locked on me. Yes, I took it. Are you happy now? Is that what you wanted to hear? His own lawyer looked horrified. Richard, sit down. But he was beyond reason, caught in the grip of his own righteous indignation. He was no longer in a deposition, he was on a pulpit, delivering the tyrant's sermon. He owes me, he bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at me across the table. Everything he has, everything he is because of me. The clothes I put on his back, the roof I kept over his head, the opportunities I gave him. Richard, for God's sake, Davies pleaded. In my day, he steamrolled on, his voice ringing with self-pity and fury. A son had a duty. It wasn't a negotiation. It was called respect. It was called honor. He wants to build a studio. His first responsibility is to make sure the parents who gave him life are secure. If that makes me a thief in your twisted, ungrateful little world, then fine. But in the real world, where family actually means something, I am a father. He stood there, panting, his chest heaving. The room was utterly silent, save for the soft whir of the video camera recording it all. His own lawyer had his head in his hands. Carol looked like she had seen a ghost. Marcus let the silence hang in the air for a full 10 seconds. Then, he looked at the stenographer, his expression unreadable. Let the record show that the witness has voluntarily confessed. He turned back to my father. Thank you, Mr. Parker. You've been very clear. Then he looked at Davies. We have nothing further. My father stood there, lost in the echo of his own tirade, convinced he had just delivered a passionate defense of family values. He had no idea he had just handed us our victory. Richard's recorded confession changed everything. The war of attrition his lawyer had planned to wage was over before it began. There would be no lengthy, agonizing trial, no parade of witnesses, no he said, she said. My father's own words had rendered all of that obsolete. Instead, we found ourselves in a quiet, wood-paneled courtroom for a summary judgment hearing. It felt less like a battle and more like a formality, a final, somber ritual to officiate a death. The room was cold, lit by the flat, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. The air smelled of old paper and furniture polish. I sat beside Marcus at the plaintiff's table, my back ramrod straight. In the gallery behind me, Aunt Jenna and Ethan sat together, their presence a silent, solid wall of support at my back. Across the aisle, my parents sat with their lawyer, Davies. Richard stared straight ahead at the judge's empty bench, his face a stony mask of defiance. But it was a brittle defiance, the kind that comes after a shattering defeat. Carol looked small and diminished, her theatrical fragility replaced by a genuine, weary pallor. She clutched a tissue in her hand, but her eyes were dry. They were sharp, and they were fixed on me with a look of pure, undiluted hatred. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Hernandez, entered and the proceedings began. The energy in the room was muted, funereal. Marcus stood and presented our motion, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He spoke calmly, laying out the undisputed facts, the transfer, the IP logs, the biometric data, and then he played the video. The conference room from the deposition appeared on a large screen facing the judge, and then my father's voice, raw and furious, filled the courtroom. He owes me. In my day, a son had a duty. If that makes me a thief in your twisted, ungrateful little world, then fine, I am a father. Hearing the words again, in this solemn, official space, stripped them of their chaotic energy and revealed them for what they were, the delusional, entitled ramblings of a tyrant. It wasn't a sermon, it was evidence. The sound of his voice, so full of righteous fury, seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. When the clip ended, a heavy silence fell. Davies stood, but his heart wasn't in it. He looked like a man who knew he was being paid to argue that gravity didn't exist. He mumbled a few phrases about a moment of high emotion, a family dispute that has regrettably escalated, and words taken out of context. It was a pathetic, half-hearted defense, and Judge Hernandez looked thoroughly unimpressed. She peered at my parents over the rim of her glasses, her expression unreadable. She reviewed the documents in front of her for a long, silent minute. Then, she took off her glasses and looked directly at Richard and Carol. In the eyes of the law, she said, her voice sharp and clear, the relationship between a parent and an adult child does not constitute a blank check. Parental trust is a sacred responsibility, not a financial instrument to be leveraged at will. The defendant's own testimony, given under oath, demonstrates a profound and disturbing belief that he is entitled to the fruits of his son's labor. He is not. She turned her attention to the papers. Therefore, the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment is granted. The words landed without ceremony. There was no dramatic gasp from the gallery, no triumphant music, just the quiet finality of the law. The court hereby orders the defendants, Richard and Carol Parker, to make full restitution to the plaintiff, Liam Parker, in the amount of $95,412, she continued, her voice a steady, implacable rhythm. Furthermore, the defendants are ordered to cover the plaintiff's legal fees. The temporary asset freeze is converted to a permanent lien against all known assets until such time as the restitution is paid in full. Finally, a permanent restraining order is granted. The defendants are to have no contact with the plaintiff, direct or indirect, for a period of 5 years. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp, definitive crack. It was over. I didn't move. I just sat there, every muscle in my body unclenching at once. I felt a wave of profound, bone-deep exhaustion wash over me. There was no surge of victory, no sweet taste of revenge. There was only the quiet, aching emptiness of an ending. I had won. I had gotten my future back. But in that room, I had officially, irrevocably, lost my parents. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. Justice was served, Liam. I nodded, unable to speak. I looked across the aisle. Richard was staring at his hands, his face ashen. Carol was gathering her purse, her movements stiff and jerky. For a fleeting second, her eyes met mine. The hatred was gone, replaced by something that looked unnervingly like a void. Then she looked away. Jenna and Ethan were waiting for me as I walked out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind us, the sound echoing down the empty marble hallway. We stepped out of the courthouse and into the afternoon light. The heavy clouds had broken, and a pale, watery Oregon sun was filtering through. I took a deep breath of the cool, clean air. It was the first breath of the rest of my life. I had won my case, but I had lost a family, and I knew, with a certainty that was both heartbreaking and liberating, that I had made the right trade. 1 year later, the pale Oregon sun streamed through the large industrial windows of my studio, illuminating the millions of dust motes dancing in the air. The space wasn't huge, but it was mine. I had found it in a renovated warehouse in the Southeast Industrial District, a small bright box with high ceilings, exposed brick, and floors scuffed with the ghosts of 100 other creative ventures. I had named it, as planned, North Star Animation. The walls were covered in concept sketches, project timelines, and storyboards. A thriving monstera plant snaked its way up a bookshelf in the corner. The constant, quiet hum of my workstation was the most comforting sound I knew. The restitution had come through in a lump sum a few months after the verdict, likely from the forced sale of the Lake Oswego house. I never asked. Marcus handled the details, and I let him. Their story was no longer my story. I used the money exactly as I had intended, for the down payment on this space, and for 6 months of operating expenses. It had been a lean, terrifying, wonderful year. I was slowly building a roster of clients, a local coffee roaster, a small tech startup, a children's book author. I wasn't getting rich, but I was paying my bills. I was building my dream, brick by painstaking brick. But the studio wasn't the most important thing I had built. That evening, my small apartment was filled with warmth and the rich, savory smell of roasted chicken and garlic. The special family dinner had been reclaimed, reforged into something new, something real. It was now a weekly tradition, a Sunday gathering at my place. The guest list was small but solid. Aunt Jenna was always the first to arrive, usually with a bottle of wine and a story about her garden. She had become the maternal figure I never truly had, a source of steady, unconditional support. Ethan was there, of course, sprawled comfortably on my couch, arguing with my friend Maya about the best sci-fi movie of the last decade. He was more of a brother to me than a cousin, our bond solidified in the trenches of the legal battle. The conversation around my small, second-hand dining table was easy and loud, punctuated by bursts of laughter. We talked about our weeks, our work, our frustrations, our small victories. No one was performing, no one was probing for information, no one was trying to manipulate or control anyone else. We were just there, together, a collection of people who had chosen to show up for one another. During a lull in the conversation, as I looked around the table at these faces, a profound sense of peace settled over me. This was family. It wasn't an obligation you were born into. It wasn't a name you shared or a debt you were forced to repay. It was a conscious choice. It was the people who saw your scars and weren't afraid. It was the people who, when you were at your absolute lowest, reached out a hand and said, "I believe you." It was the people who defended you when you couldn't defend yourself. It was this table, in this small apartment, filled with mismatched chairs and easy laughter. Later, as Ethan was helping me clear the dishes, he nodded toward a small object on my bookshelf. It was a new piggy bank I'd bought a few months ago, a simple, elegant ceramic star glazed in a deep cobalt blue. A North Star. "Good to see you got a new one," he said with a small smile. "This one looks a lot sturdier." I rinsed a plate and placed it in the dishwasher, the gesture feeling simple and domestic and deeply peaceful. "Yeah," I said, looking over at the star. "This one's just for show, a reminder." I turned back to him, the words coming easily, truthfully. I don't need to hide my money anymore. After everyone had left, I stood in the quiet of my apartment, looking at the comfortable mess of a well-spent evening. The lingering smell of food, the wine glasses on the counter, the chairs slightly askew. This was my life now. Not a life of fear and suspicion, of hiding and fighting, but a life of warmth, trust, and creative work. A life I had chosen, a life I had fought for, a life I had built. I turned off the lights and stood in the dark for a moment, the city lights of Portland twinkling through my window. I was finally, truly, home. A year and a half after the verdict, I stood at a worn wooden lectern in the basement of a community center. The room smelled of old coffee and rain-soaked coats. The chairs were a mismatched collection of plastic and metal, and they were filled with strangers. An older man whose hands never stopped twisting in his lap. A young woman who stared at the floor, a curtain of hair hiding her face. A middle-aged man in a suit who looked like he had just come from a boardroom where he'd been pretending everything was fine. We were all strangers, yet I knew we shared a secret language of loss and betrayal. I gripped the sides of the lectern, my knuckles white, and began. When I was 7, I said, my voice quiet but steady in the small room, my father smashed my piggy bank and told me it was just a loan. When I was 12, he pawned my skateboard for a sure thing. When I was 16, he taught me to hide my money. And 2 years ago, while I slept, my parents used my own hand to steal my entire future. The room was utterly still. I told them everything, the lies, the gaslighting, the cold, sterile courtroom, the ugly, validating confession. I spoke of the shame that clings to you when the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. We are told that blood is sacred, I continued, looking out at the faces before me. We are told that family is everything. But blood cannot be an excuse for cruelty, and family cannot be a cage. Family is supposed to protect your dreams, not consume them. I saw a woman in the second row lift her head, her face streaked with tears. For those of you in this room who carry scars like mine, I said, my voice gaining strength, I want to leave you with this. Those scars do not mean you are broken, they mean you survived. Every mark you carry is a testament to your endurance. It is proof that you are stronger than the thing that tried to destroy you. The woman in the second row raised a trembling hand. I've been too afraid, she whispered, her voice cracking. My husband, he controls every dollar. I have nothing that's my own. But hearing you survive it, it makes me believe I can go. My throat tightened. I gave her a small nod. You can, I said, the words feeling truer than anything I had ever said. And you deserve to. When I finished, I didn't feel drained. I felt a sense of purpose I had never known. My pain, once a source of shame and isolation, had become a bridge. And that's why I'm telling you all this now. My journey isn't really finished. Healing isn't a destination, it's a process, and some days are harder than others. There are nights when the past whispers a little too loudly, but now I have my family, Jenna, Ethan, and the friends who chose to stand with me. And now I have you, listening, bearing witness. If you've come this far with me, let me ask one last time. Show me you're here. Drop a simple, I'm here, or I see you, in the comments below. It's a small act, but it tells me these words aren't just echoing in the dark. It reminds me, and anyone else reading, that connection is real, even across screens and miles. If you believe stories like this matter, subscribe and stay. Every view, every comment, every single voice helps this community grow. We are not just telling stories here. We are building a circle of truth, a circle strong enough to hold anyone who has been cast out by blood but chosen by love. So please, take this with you. You are not alone. You never were. And if no one else has told you today, you are worthy of safety, worthy of respect, and worthy of a love that does not demand you set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Protect your dreams, guard your boundaries, and when the time is right, tell your story. The world needs to hear it.